Just FYI.
All right. So good day, everyone, and peace upon you, be upon you all. And today, in this interview, we have Dr. Joshua Swamidass, and he is somebody who has written a very nice book to read, which is the Genealogical Adam and Eve. I have personally enjoyed reading the book, and actually, it's a very nice book to read, and it tries to answer the question about whether science and the story of Adam and Eve can come together to a common ground. So, Josh, can you start by giving us something about your background and then the gist of the book?
Yeah, you also asked me to present a little bit about it, so I just pulled up some slides and I'll show you those too. First, I want to thank you for having me here. I'm a Christian. I follow Jesus, as some Muslims do, but I'm not as familiar with the Muslim conversation about this. So so this is actually the very first interview by a Muslim. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you about it and understanding more about how your faith makes sense of these sorts of questions too, and learning about that. So thank you for having me as a Christian to talk about that with you.
Yeah. So let's start by knowing you more, Josh. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, I'm a scientist, right? So I don't work for any origins organization. I spend all my time actually just studying, God's creation with science. I'm at Washington University in St. Louis, and I do actually work on a large range of things, mainly applying artificial intelligence to drug development, but also things in healthcare. And then I got kind of sucked up into these questions about origins, just because as a person who cares about what Scripture says, it really seemed like the human account of origins was really different than what the scientific account was, and I wanted to make sense of that. I was raised a young Earth creationist, but slowly saw more and more the evidence, especially for myself. I got to see it directly for evolution, and there was a tension, right? And I wanted to make sense of it, and I really came to the point of affirming evolutionary science once I really saw that there was really no conflict at all with the scriptural record, and it just seemed obvious to me. But as more and more I looked into it and talked to people, I just found out that the way I was thinking about it was very surprising to other people, to the point that they didn't know existed. And through entertaining story and string of fortunate and unfortunate events, I ended up writing this book to help make sense of it, which I've been really pleased to see has had a really big impact on the conversation and showing that there are better ways forward than most people have taken on this.
All right. So I know you're also a medical doctor, and also you did your PhD, and you're currently a computational biologist. Is that correct?
That's right. So I was in graduate school for 9 years, from when I was 21 to when I was 30. So that's a long time.
Pretty long time, yeah.
But right, I'm really fortunate. I really love being a scientist. I mean, God made me to be a scientist.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. And in your book, you describe yourself, and I think in many interviews, you describe yourself as a scientist in the church and a Christian in science. So does this present your mission statement of trying to find a common ground between both?
Well, I find myself between worlds. There's the scientific world, and there's the Christian world of the church, and I'm really fully a member of the church, but also feel like a foreigner sometimes because I'm a scientist. And then I really am fully a member of the scientific community, and I really fully find myself there. But at the same time, I sometimes feel like a foreigner because I'm a Christian. And so I think that's kind of what that conveys, like a dual identity that kind of puts me in a third space between those two. And so this book really does arise out of trying to take both those worlds seriously.
So maybe let's have the gist of the book, and then we have a discussion about what it's trying to achieve. So thank you for having a presentation for us here, and I'll be putting it on the screen.
Pop that on the screen. All right. So this is a presentation that I just tweaked just a little bit for you. You'll see in a sec, but we're going to be talking about Adam and Eve and evolution. That's what the topic of my book is. I talked to you already a little bit about who I am. This is me with a couple of graduate students that I've had that have graduated. These are 2 other MD PhDs that are doing really great work. I give a lot of talks about my scientific work, but that's not what we're going to be talking about here today. Key thing that I want you to know about this book is that it's a bit unusual in that it really arises out of a civic practice of science. I was really fortunate to get funding to really gather a pretty large community of people to workshop the book. I'm not a theologian, so I need a lot of help on this. This ended up being a pretty diverse group. There is people that are Catholic and Protestant right here. In the left, you can see a leading Jewish population geneticist. There is people who affirmed evolution, people who don't. Most of them were Christian. There wasn't any Muslims in the room, which is one thing that was unfortunate. But there was an atheist, which was really interesting too. Nathan Lentz there, who ended up endorsing the book. Both Alan Templeton and Nathan did. So there wasn't any Muslims in the conversation then, but they were in my mind. I knew more about the Christian view of it. And since my book came out, there has been some responses from Muslims, and I have been trying to understand more of how Muslims think about this. This article I do recommend. It's been helpful for me in understanding how what I'm doing really fits in with the Muslim conversation. And I sent that to you too, right, Ahmed?
Yeah, you did, but I had already read it before, and actually I also had some written exchange with Dr. Shoaib, and maybe I'll have a discussion with him some later.
Yeah, maybe put him in contact with me too. So I mean, I learned about the word what kufr means. It means like basically disallowable beliefs, and that's a big question that is facing Islam. I know that there are some parts of Islam that have had no problem with evolution, and some parts of the faith that have been very opposed to it. So I think the conversation can be just as interesting in your world as it has been for us.
It is, and actually, I guess you already know that I do not accept certain aspects of the theory of evolution, especially the neo-Darwinian mechanisms, and I guess we'll have to go across that, because I think an essential part of your story is this marriage between the story of the people outside and inside the garden. So it's really interesting to me also to go into that, because I think part of your story is that you started as an Earth creationist, completely rejecting evolution, and then later on you changed your mind. So maybe we'll also go through that within the discussion.
Sure, we can talk about that. And I think maybe a person might read my book and still reject evolution. I mean, that in a lot of ways is beside the point. I'm not trying to convince people that evolution is true. That's not the purpose of this book. Rather, it's just showing that if it were true, it wouldn't be in conflict with what we know from Scripture. So what's going on here? We have 2 different stories. I talked about this already. You have like the story of Adam and Eve. Can you see my pointer, or is that just something I get to see?
I can see the pointer, yeah.
All right, so you have the story of Adam and Eve. You have the story of evolution, which says that we arise out of like a progression of forms from the great apes. And then the story of Adam and Eve, which says that there's a specially created couple from whom we all descend. My book really sits, it's called The Genealogical Adam and Eve. It really sits in between these 2 stories, and it shows how both stories could be literally true in the same physical world. It's not going to take this story and make it mythical or metaphorical. It's going to treat it really literally, almost the same as I would have really read it as a young Earth creationist, or even how a fundamentalist Muslim might read it. So let's break this down. The way how most people have read Genesis through history is that they were created without parents less than 10,000 years ago, and they're ancestors of all of us. Those 3 claims. Now, some people have dropped 1 or 2 of these claims, and some people have advocated dropping all 3 of them. But this is how most people through history really understood it, and that's been long before evolution. And it was really introduced as an idea, and most Christians that reject evolution would say that these are among the core reasons why they reject evolution, because it entails rejecting these 3 things. Now, evolution, I want to define it.
those who reject three things are those who say that they are metaphorical. But we're not trying to reconcile those because they completely threw it away, right?
Yeah, and so what I'm trying to say is that, yeah, there are Christians or maybe even Muslims that say that Adam and Eve are entirely metaphorical. They do it by getting rid of these three, often because they say it's in conflict evolution because they know it's true, right? And yeah, of course, that that does solve the conflict, but it does it at the expense of really dispensing with how most people have read Genesis, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And
I think there are very, in the Muslim side, there are very, very, very few who would essentially even dare say that Adam and Eve are metaphorical. But there might be one or two, but it's almost not there.
Yeah, well, my observation of the Muslim conversation from the outside is that it hasn't been as large as the Christian conversation on this topic. So it's hopefully, you know, this will create space for conversation. I think the conversation may have been difficult at times for Muslims because for a whole host of reasons. But I think what we'll see too, especially when we consider the political situation in the Middle East, a lot of the things that I really bring out in the Genesis story are actually deeply connected to the concerns of many Muslims too, and especially in terms of we start thinking about questions of race, right?
Yeah.
And colonialism in particular. I think actually the Genesis narrative is deeply anti-colonial, which is, I think, is important. And we've talked about that a little bit too on the side, right, Ahmed?
Yeah.
But now if we go to evolution, you brought up the issue of, well, what is evolution? What you're talking about? To be clear, I'm not talking about some godless process. I'm talking about two focused claims that we share common ancestors with the great apes. That means that if you trace back our lineages far enough in the past, that we actually share common ancestors with, chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, and orangutans. That's one claim of evolution. As a scientist, I can tell you there's an immense amount of support for this. If you're attracted to intelligent design, I can tell you that even a lot of ID leaders agree with me that there's a lot of evidence for it. For example, Behe does, and others as well. And then also that we arise as a population, not a single couple. If you look at our ancestors in the past, it never dips down to a single couple. At least it doesn't look that way. Now, I think that those claims have sometimes been overstated, but I think we can say with certainty that I've never seen a model that shows that our ancestors dipped down to a single couple in the last 100,000 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe more ancient than that it could work, but more recent than that, there's never been a model that is consistent with the data that could show like less than 10,000 years ago that there was an Adam and Eve couple with that all of our ancestors funnel down to. Okay. Now, it seems on face value that these two things are in conflict.
Yeah, well, I'll have some questions for you later about this matter of common descent and.
Yeah, we can talk about that. We can talk about that. But I'm punting on the question of mechanism entirely. And, as a person who believes that God exists and is involved in creation, I entirely expect that God has directly intervened in the rise of humans and the evolution of life across the earth. I have no opposition to miracles in that process, and I have no opposition to natural process as part of that too. Darwinism, meaning a godless process, is not really what science teaches. Darwinism, meaning positive selective change, is not what science teaches either. So that's not really what the issue could be. I mean, that could be maybe the reason why we wouldn't accept Dawkins' version of evolution, but that's not the scientific version. So that shouldn't really be a concern to us. Does that make sense?
You're making a separation between evolution and atheism. I think this is what you want to say.
Yeah. So as a Christian, we're always going to understand, or as a Muslim, I imagine too, but as a Christian, I'm always going to understand the scientific account as just a partial account. That is not the whole story. And so if I understand it as a partial account, I know there's a bigger story to be told. And I can, the details can be filled in different ways. From scripture or theology, I might know some of it, but a lot of times I don't. And I think theology doesn't give us a lot of details in how evolution was guided, just that God providentially governed it. And he could have intervened or he could not have. We don't know those details, and we'll find out. But it's not like science somehow rules that out or is in conflict with those affirmations. Does that make
All
sense?
right. I'll have some comments about that when we go forward with it.
Sure. But this is what I mean when I say evolution, right?
Absolutely. It's more like a theistic evolution. Is that fair to call it like that?
Well, I mean, I'm a Christian. I mean, I would just say that it's just more of it's a maybe mere evolution. It's like evolution devoid of a lot of those big theological claims. I'm just talking about like evolutionary science. Evolutionary science doesn't tell us if God was involved or not. It just tells us that it looks like we share common ancestors with the great apes. So that is really true. It really looks like we share common ancestors with the great apes. It doesn't really tell us if and how God was involved. So it's mere evolution is, I think, what I'm really trying to engage with here. Does that make sense?
Let's call it mere evolution, and I'll get back to questions about that when you finish the
Sure. So the key thing to recognize, this is a key insight when you look at those two things that really starts to unravel the conflict entirely, is that there's actually a big question mark in those definitions about what's happening outside the garden. And this is a key part of the Genesis tradition, certainly among both Jews and Christians. And I imagine if you look closely among Muslims, it'll be similar too. There's a lot of statements about Adam and Eve, but there's very little said, if anything said, about what's going on outside the garden. If you read Genesis, the garden had borders. I've heard even some Muslims say that the garden wasn't even on earth, it was in heaven.
There is controversy here in Islam about whether the garden was in heaven and then Adam and Eve went down.
Some Christians held to that view too. And so some people said that Adam and Eve were actually angels in heaven, and then they fell from heaven onto earth. Now, the key point here, though, is that you can say things about Adam and Eve before they fell and about what's going on in the garden / heaven, but it doesn't really tell you anything about what's going on outside the garden or on the rest of earth, right? There's a big question mark there. All right, now one way to make sense of that is to erase the question mark and say that there's nothing there, okay? That is consistent with Genesis in some ways, but is no ways demanded on it. This is one traditional view, but the key part of the tradition is that it's really a question mark. We can't erase the question mark without really departing drastically from the tradition. So remembering that the question mark is there, I tried to fill it in this way and wondered, well, maybe there were people outside the garden that God created in a different way from Adam and Eve, and that Adam and Eve encountered them when they left the garden, right? And interbred with them. And as they interbred and mixed and spread across the entire globe, that's how Adam and Eve became ancestors of us all. That's the basic idea. Now, there turns out to be a lot of people who've actually wondered this in history. What's probably different and new about the way how I approached it is that I may be the first scientist that has really looked at this closely to see what constraints the genetic data and what else we know puts on us.
Yeah.
Now, the first key thing to recognize is that there's a difference between genetic and genealogical ancestry. This is a graph that shows you right here, Ahmed, with your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents and shells going about back 10 generations, okay? And so you're black because that's, showing that you share 100% of your genome. It's 100% identical, right?
All right.
Now, about 50% of your genome, so it's about 50% gray right here, you get from your father and from your mother. Do you see that?
All right, makes sense.
And then there's about 50% you get from each of your grandparents, and about 25% from each of your great grandparents. And you can start to see there's this variation. It's because you're not getting exactly from the same proportion from each of them. It starts to be a little bit varied, right? And you start going back, not that far back. We're talking maybe about 6 generations back, 7 generations back. There starts to be these people here that appear that are all green. And green, I really labeled here as genetic ghosts. These are people that are your ancestors that actually gave you no DNA. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
They really are your ancestors. You arise by, reproductive physical ancestry from them, but they just didn't give you any DNA. And that way they're genetic ghosts. They're not visible in your DNA. And
so maybe I have a great grandfather who was Japanese, and I have no Japanese features whatsoever.
Not only that, you wouldn't even have any DNA from them. If you go back.
Yeah.
Now, if you go back far enough to just 10 generations or so here, that's about just a few hundred years, a few centuries. So it's not that far back. It turns out the majority, around 2/3 of the people that you descend from, don't give you any DNA.
Mm-hmm.
That once again is surprising. And it turns out that even though genetics can tell you a lot about your really close familial connections, like your father and your mother, and we can do a paternity test, for example, to figure out who your father is. It really can't tell us nearly as much as we thought when we start to get to the past of a few hundred years ago. When we start getting to a few thousand years ago, turns out the vast majority of your ancestors or our ancestors are genetic ghosts. They're outside the genetic streetlight. They're really in our peripheral vision at best, but really not there. So what that means is that Adam and Eve here, you can see them here. If they lived a few thousand years ago, all right, they would most likely be genetic ghosts. And so what we have here is we have Adam and Eve that produce a bunch of children, and their children intermarry, and we don't show who they're intermarrying with. Okay. And every time they intermarry, that dilutes their Adam and Eve's genetics, and it kind of just dissipates into the ocean, kind of like almost like a drop of water, right? Except for the drop of water still exists. So the fact of Adam and Eve and their genome is that most likely that we just don't have any evidence of it anymore. So that's the first surprising thing. That means that we don't really have any evidence to really judge whether or not they were de novo created or not. And if God created them with the purpose of being able to interbreed with everyone else, they would have a genome that was very, very similar. The other big surprises that come is that there's a lot of universal genealogical ancestors, and they spread across the globe. In fact, if you picked out anyone really across the globe about 6,000 years ago, really anyone about 6,000 years ago, and certainly someone in the Middle East, they would most likely be, ancestors of everyone by 81 when Jesus walks the earth. For Christians, what's said about Jesus and his message is really important because the Bible teaches us that's supposed to go to the ends of the earth. That God was saying something really important through Jesus that he really wanted the whole earth to hear about. And
I have a fun fact here for you. In the Quran, there is an ayah. An ayah is like a verse that implies that we can actually drive this line of 81 back to Moses.
Well, that's possible too. That it all depends when you date Moses. You might have to move back when Adam and Eve are, but still, the point is that really there's a lot of flexibility. I don't know anyone who's proposing Adam and Eve more recent than 6,000 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And if you're going just 6,000 years, I mean, it could be anytime more ancient than 6,000 years ago too. So there are reasons why people want to push them back. And maybe if you thought Moses was at a particular time, that would matter. But I'm considering people across the entire globe. But it's important to recognize that when Genesis is written, frankly, even when the Quran is written, most people didn't even know about people on the other side of the globe. So when they talked about the earth, the most they could have really meant when they wrote those things would have been, the known world, which is far more local than it is for us. All right.
Yeah.
So what happens now is we have an account that shows the traditional account of Adam and Eve, the traditional account of human origins here, with the story of what's going outside the garden, in the background, not maybe in the peripheral vision. And then in science, in same physical reality, we have evolution giving rise to civilization. I think that civilization and I think to connect with the Muslim experience in much of the world, I think that colonialism and what even might be called the spread of Christendom is really clearly connected to the fall of Adam and Eve. I would say that was not a good dominion. That wasn't what God originally intended. It was often very abusive and wrong. And so you can see that here. And then Adam and Eve fall into a blind spot. you know? And then it's all in the same physical reality. And so maybe what really happened, like the way how sacred and natural history entwine, is that God created us by a process of common descent. And then he reached into our story and made Adam and Eve in a specially created garden. But then they fell and created a fallen world that was driven by dominating one another, by inappropriate use of power. And evolution, all those people created by evolution, they ended up falling into Adam and Eve's broken world. So I think it gives us a really coherent account of these two stories together. And like that's the basic story. And so if you want to check out more, I mean, I explain a lot from a Christian point of view. It'll be really interesting to see how Muslims respond to it. I think we're really engaging in ancient conversation here, and there's a lot of fun to be had. So that's the key things I wanted to share. You can take the slides off now, and we can talk from here.
Yeah. All right, that was interesting. So let me try to summarize that. So I'm sure also I understood what you were saying in the book. So number one, in the book, somewhere you mentioned that if we consider that there are some lineage gaps, we can actually push Adam and Eve back up to 12,000 years, right? So we have a little bit of flexibility here, right?
Well, so I think there's very good evidence that there's gaps. And I think the important thing to understand is when you read Genesis, it says this person begat that. And it can be talking about fathers giving rise to sons, but often we know from that culture, there's several pieces of evidence, both internal to scripture and external to it as well, that is better understood probably as begetting a lineage. So, or it can be understood to that. So it's saying that person was the ancestor of this person, and there could have been gaps in that. And so it doesn't literally mean son or daughter. It can mean, it means literally rather ancestor. That's a better way to translate those Hebrew words.
So actually, even in the Quran, a fun fact that the word father in the Quran is actually, in many occasions, used for grandfather, or essentially it means a male in your ancestry. So,
well, I think it's funny. I think those of us that come from different cultures, like you and I mean, I was born here in the United States, but I'm Indian, right? So I know some Indian culture. I think we're actually at an advantage at thinking about these things, because when you read a text like Genesis or the Quran, it really is from a different culture. That doesn't mean it's lying to us. It's just not using words all the time in the same way we do, right? And I think we're accustomed to that. So I didn't know that was how it worked in the Arabic language, but that makes a ton of sense to me. Because there's like a certain way, especially kinship is talked about in very different ways across cultures, right? And so even in the young earth creationist world that's committed to 6,000 years, they will admit that there are young earth creationists that are willing to push back Adam and Eve as far as 20,000 years ago. That they can support that from the text. And so, yeah.
So the gist of the book, as I get it, is like this: if some people are making the scientific case that Adam and Eve could not have existed because the genome of the modern human being seems to suggest that it is not coming from exactly two people, then this objection can be dismissed by saying that they are our ancestors in terms of being in the family tree of each one of us. And since they are thousands of years away, their genetics, because in your proposal, has been diluted into a much larger population, then this dilution can make them like ghosts in the genome. And if Adam had a specific eye color that was even unique, being diluted in such a big population means that maybe nobody today has his eye color, but he is still everybody's father. This is what the genealogy is about. Yeah,
that's exactly right. So it turns out then that both stories could be true, that we do all descend from Adam and Eve. Remember, that doesn't say that Adam and Eve's lineage was pure and never interbred with others, just that we all descend from them. And at the same time, we share common ancestry with the great apes. It's kind of like we all have a mother and a father. We all descend from our father, but we also descend from our mother.
Well, I'll come to the great apes matter, but you use this statement in your book. It says that genetics is like a street light or telescope. Can you further explain what you mean by that? What do you mean by a street light and a telescope, and where does that leave genealogy?
Well, there's a tension here because genetics does tell us quite a bit about the past, but then somehow everyone thought it could answer these questions about Adam and Eve, but it can't. So how do we make sense of that? I think the imagery of a streetlight and a telescope, or even a microscope and a telescope, can really help us, right? So the streetlight is actually a really common story that scientists tell ourselves, how we're out there trying to understand what's going on in the world, but it's trying to understand all of Manhattan, which is a really big city in New York, right? Trying to understand all of Manhattan Island when you only have the light of a single streetlight. That's kind of what science is, and that's what I'm saying about genetics. And in that sense, genetics does kind of illuminate our immediate vicinity. We can do paternity tests and sibling tests with genetics and get very highly accurate statements about what's there under that streetlight. But at the same token, it's like a telescope. We're able to look into the very, very distant past, right? I do think that there's very strong evidence for common ancestry with the great apes. We can discuss that later if you want. Once again, you may disagree with me or not, but I'd say the vast majority of scientists, and I've talked to Muslim scientists, I'd even say the majority of Muslim scientists agree that it just looks like we share common ancestry with the great apes. So how do we make sense of being able to say those things with such certainty? But it turns out, with a streetlight, you can't see things that are outside the streetlight, right? And with a telescope, it really, clouds your peripheral vision. I can be looking at the rings of Saturn through a telescope, but I wouldn't be able to see my wife sitting right next to me because, that power of being able to see that far into the distance comes with really great limitations of not being able to see outside that field of view. And so genetics does tell us something important. It's legitimate. Not genetic science, and we should be watching it and learning about our past, but it doesn't tell us everything. In fact, it only tells us a tiny speck of minority of what has actually been in the past, and we should remember that as we think about the other accounts alongside that. For example, the scriptural account.
Okay, so let me ask you this question, because while I was reading the book, I was waiting because you have explored so many possibilities in the book. But you didn't explore this one possibility. So let me, at a point you discussed genetic drives, but I was waiting for something else. So Adam and Eve have been, in your theology and my theology, have been created de novo from dust, and Adam is from dust and Eve is from his side or from a rib. And so
I'm saying
there
it's
is an
possible. I
exception.
don't really commit either way, but I say it's possible scientifically. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, in the theology, this is how it is. So we can go.
Okay, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
So in the theology, in the theology, this is how the story works, except for those who would take them as metaphorical beings. So the story this way does not imply uniformitarianism, right? So those are two human beings that are created in an exceptional way, correct?
Yes, but uniformitarianism is not, I don't know how helpful of a term that is in this case. I would say they were created, outside a purely natural order, right? That's what it is. It's special creation, but miracles don't violate uniformitarianism. So,
yeah, the reason why I'm bringing this up is to put forward this question. When we today look at the human genome and make a conclusion like this couldn't have come from just two persons, doesn't that implicitly have the assumption that the two persons that we are looking for have the same features of genetics that we have in our genome? I mean, what if you have an Adam and Eve who have been exceptionally created, but the way their genetics worked is not exactly the way our genetics work today? Maybe for eye color, each of them had, I don't know, 20 possibilities.
So you're saying that they were different, in genetics, but that we just lost those genetic differences. So yes, that is a possibility. I mean, I did explore that. I said that one possibility is that they were specially created and were different, right? So that is actually discussed. Now, the part that I say is a bit of I think is going to be a bit hard, is to say that they were specially created recently and were different, and those differences passed to all of us, or genetically different, and those genetic differences passed to all of us. I think that's a problem. But if you're going to say that they were genetically different and that their genetic differences did not pass to all of us, that's not necessarily a problem. Like, so for example, maybe they had orange eyes or purple eyes, something that you just never see today. And maybe that was around for a short time and then it kind of just died out. That's that lineage of that genetic lineage of purple eyes. Maybe because people, thought it was ugly or something. I don't know. Or maybe just happened randomly. That's possible. I'm not sure what it buys you exactly theologically, but it could have happened, I guess. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I mean, what if they? I'm saying, because the obstacle of accepting an Adam and Eve who are not only genealogical ancestors but are also genetic ancestors, is that in the current population you have maybe all those different possible traits for a single feature, right? And maybe it was not that way with Adam and Eve. Maybe they had all the diversity already in their genome. This is one suggestion that I can put forward to you. And the second thing is that since you already accept divine providence in guiding the evolutionary process.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So you're not talking about, let's just slow down and then take them one at a time. Let's leave the divine providence later. So what you're suggesting is, what if Adam and Eve, so you're not talking about a genealogical Adam and Eve scenario with people outside the garden. You're saying, what if there was no one outside the garden and Adam and Eve had just special genetics and they work different than us? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. Is that a possibility too?
So
or can we rule that out?
Well,
by the evidence,
we can't say much at all about it with that level of detail. You start filling details. So Reasons to Believe has actually played ball with us on this. So it turns out that we can actually say at different points in history about how many lineages there were, genetic lineages. So if you want less than 10,000 years ago, that would be very hard to pull off. I mean, just because there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of lineages across the globe spread out, and so that would mean Adam and Eve would have had to have quite a large number of children. Now, the bigger problem becomes people who want to go down this path also want to say that there was a bottleneck through Noah and his family as well. And so that means that you're limited to just 10 genomes. And if you care about that, the evidence really does push that. And I've never heard of anyone claiming about special genetics in Noah, right? So that would really seem to push it back at least 180,000 years ago. Now, Reasons to Believe put forward the idea of maybe each of, Eve's eggs had a different genome in it. And Adam and Eve had maybe up to 30 different children. And so maybe like 190,000 years ago, there was Adam and Eve, right? And there was about, that number of genomes up to that amount there. And then maybe around 180,000 years ago, there was the Noahic flood that kind of gave them bottleneck down to 10. And then we all arise from that bottleneck. Now, that is not necessarily in conflict with evidence. I mean, there's some questions around it, but that could possibly work. But it does seem to rule out a much more recent Adam and Eve. I don't know how that could work, even if you got rid of the Noah part of it.
Well, maybe the Noah part will be problematic for those who believe that the flood was universal. But if you believe that the flood was local to Noah's people, then it wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, but then the problem then still becomes, it wouldn't, that kind of special biology, it's one thing to claim that for Adam and Eve because they're specially created. It's another thing to claim that for their children. That's a lot. I mean, I haven't heard anyone claim that yet. And I'm not really sure how that would work. I mean, I'm a pretty creative guy. I'm not trying to just be saying no. I mean, if there's a way I can make sense of it, I would let you know. But that would imply that they had, hundreds, if not thousands of children And I don't really understand that. I mean, even if you want to be angry with creationists, there's nothing that says that God didn't create people outside the garden 6,000 years ago and Adam and Eve in the garden. So I wouldn't understand why you would just discard that as a solution.
Okay, so I was just putting forward one possibility. Now, the second possibility, let's consider that there are people outside the garden. In the Quran, for example, when God declares to the angels that he is going to create Adam, he says, I'm going to create a Khalifa, and what that means is a ruler.
Yeah,
or
I thought that was
both.
You sent me an email telling me that the way how the Quran refers to Adam as Khalifa, which it's interesting because that's actually very concordant with how I'm reading the Genesis story, right? That's great. So keep on going. Tell your story. What you're thinking with that. Oh, I lost you.
No, I'm here. Yeah. Actually, in your book, you refer to the image of God, and part of it is being vocational or having regency or having authority by God to be to have dominion over the earth. And actually, this is upfront in the Genesis story in the Quran, that Adam and then Eve, but Adam was created with the new feature of dominion, and that he will have free will, and that this is his test, is to come to God or to come to Allah. God is just another name. Willingly, voluntarily. And the Islamic narrative is that Adam did not get out.
Bluetooth connected.
Is that Adam did not get out of the garden only as a consequence for his sin, but it seems from many readings, or from the majority of the ones that I have been exposed to, and my personal opinion too, that God makes this declaration prior to creating Adam, and hence creating Adam was to put him on earth outside the garden from the beginning. So the doctrine of original sin is is not the driving factor there. But the interesting part about it now is that when he does this declaration, the angels reply with a comment that, why are you going to create him, God?
Well, it seems like we lost Ahmed. I think we're still online, so I'll start talking to you while he reconnects. So I think one of the cool things about how this works is that the way how he's actually describing. Oh, there you are. You're back. I was actually starting to kind of explain to them what you were saying, but
yeah,
so you're saying that they were kind of upset because they wanted to be the rulers instead, right?
No. So the angels were putting forward this, that how come you will create a human, and then the human will have the capacity of bloodshed. And so the question is, how do they know about bloodshed unless they have seen a previous example? So many Islamic scholars would go that human beings, the lineage of Adam and Eve, were not the first that angels have seen, and that angels were expressing this concern of like, those guys are going to come, and now there's going to be problems because they have dominion and they have free will. So they were inquisitive. How would that?
This gets to actually, I mean, that's parallels a discussion in Christianity, because God tells Adam and Eve that he'd die if he ate of the fruit. But how would he know what death was if he'd never seen death, right?
Yeah.
And so there's, and then, if he's being called a ruler or Khalifa, I mean, a lot of theologians have inferred that he is going to be having dominion, or he's a ruler. But if it's said directly in Islam, I think that raises questions too about who's he ruling over.
Well, even the word Khalifa in the Quran is used literally for two persons. So it's used for Adam prior to his creation, and it's used for David, Prophet David. God speaks to him.
Yeah, but if there's no one outside the garden, if there's no one on earth and it's just Adam and Eve, like, who's he ruling over? That doesn't make any sense. Like, it actually has an implication if there's someone he's ruling over.
Well, that can be one interpretation. And the other interpretation, which is what I also found interesting in your book, is that even if there were humans other than Adam and Eve on earth, that they live this peaceful life where there is no struggle for power. They're like other creatures.
Well, I'd say it's characterized, but of course there's going to be bad apples, right? And people will still sin and do wrong, but it never has quite the same impact that we see once, civilization begins, right? Like, you never see anything like colonialism.
Yeah.
Before civilization.
So it was a peaceful world. But then my question to you is, let us say there are people outside the garden. Okay. And that Adam was created to bring forward to the world a person who has the choice to follow religion or not, who can make up his way of life, and that this way of life can be in concordance with what God wants a religious life to be, a righteous and just life, or he can be evil. He can have somebody like Abel and somebody like Cain, and then Cain is jealous and he kills Abel. And let's say that this was the mission, and the reason is that God wants to eventually bring to his presence those who exemplify his image voluntarily, because we also have the image of God in Islam, in Hadith, not in Quran, but in Hadith. So my question to you is, even if we let's because your book is like a thought experiment, and I like your expression. So let's have this thought experiment that there were people outside of the garden, but they did not have a covenant with God. And here comes Adam. Why do we have to accept that those people are there by descent from apes? Why can't they have an origin that we are agnostic to, that is also a direct creation from God, from their own ancestor that is 200,000 years before Adam? Why is that?
Of course, that could have happened. I would just say that it really looks like it was common descent. So you'd have to explain, why is it that God created them in a way that looks like common descent if that's not what happened? And maybe you have a good explanation. I mean, I don't, but I wouldn't stand in the way of you coming up with a good explanation for that. But it's just the fact that matters. It looks like common descent. That doesn't mean God wasn't involved. There's just a lot of positive evidence for that. And a lot of people have had a difficult time accepting that because they thought it was in conflict with the scriptural story. But I think you can agree, hopefully you're coming along and maybe might even agree with me now that there isn't actually a conflict. It's not that scripture tells us the precise origin of those other people. So we have freedom there. So if that's the case, we should kind of like diffuse like the religious conflict around it. It's not really about scripture now. We can now more kind of see, well, what does the evidence give us on this? And I'm just telling you, it's very easy to see for people who are trained in this, and I'm happy to show it to you sometime, maybe in a different episode. There's a lot of evidence for common descent, and that's it's particularly for human evolution. And so, and because I have no theological or scriptural objection to it, and it's completely theologically coherent, why not just say that? And so I kind of shrug and go, okay, well, let's take the scientific account there. Why not?
Let me give you this small objection there, because I liked something about your book is that when we accept that there are people outside the garden, you still give them dignity and you still give them their humanity, because we're not getting away from, brothers and sisters marrying to a bestiality here. So what you're saying is that
they were humans. God wanted Adam and Eve's lineage to interbreed. He just wanted Adam to act better towards them and not treat them like animals because they weren't.
Yeah. So the question is, if those are created in the image of God and they're humans, except that Adam is now bringing religion and bringing freedom of choice and voluntary.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say. I think the people before had freedom of choice. I wouldn't necessarily say they have freedom of choice, but maybe more opportunities is a better way to put it.
Well, I'm coming to that too. So my first question is, if in your, this is now a philosophical question, what would be dignified in your opinion? Somebody who's created from dust directly by God, or somebody who has evolved from apes? Because why I have the objection against the evolution from apes, if we want to theologically give those people the same dignity, is that to me, if God wants to give them the same dignity, I wouldn't find that my ancestor being an ape is the same level of dignity as God created me from dust.
Well, I think you're a little bit confused about the relationship between dust and apes, because apes are far more dignified than dust.
Well,
give me a break. You can do whatever the hell you want to a pile of dust. You cannot do whatever you want to an ape. So I'm not really sure the logic of that argument.
Yeah, so the logic of that argument is, well, dust is not, dust is neutral.
No, dust is completely worthless, is what it is. It is not neutral. It is, and if you look at the actual text, it's saying that God's making humans out of the same stuff as everything else on earth. And so we're very continuous with the creation is a key part of what it's saying. Look, I mean, another way to understand it too is, look, I mean, I think that there is space for God creating people, God de novo out of the dust, right, without parents. And I think, let's say that that's what happens. I think that actually is a metaphorical or an object lesson, or it actually echoes. It's a prophetic echo of him creating people out of the apes. Apes are the dust of the earth.
Okay, so it goes back to my question. If somebody accepts outside the garden, but not descendant of apes, it does not affect your narrative, actually.
It doesn't.
It doesn't.
It theologically, from a narrative point of view, it matters. I mean, I think what you're talking about is, I think, a long history of opposing evolution that's kind of built into us, kind of like a learned disgust at this idea. I think that's where this is coming from. But that's not actually the reality when you look at what's going on. I mean, this is something that's actually fairly mundane. I mean, if when you think about dust is very low on the totem pole. To think that would be a better place to come from than God forming us out of a hominid ancestor or with common ancestors is a bit strange from a logical point of view.
Well, the issue is that dust is just materials, and we are material beings, so we are eventually from dust. But if I tell you I'm selling you this car, I made this car from metal and minerals, de novo for you, it means something different if I tell you I refurbished this car from parts of other cars that were used 20 times before you.
Except for in most cases, that would mean it's far more valuable if it was refurbished. Because if someone's going through the trouble to do that, there's a reason why there's something valuable there. Like, maybe there's a car from the 1950s that you're refurbishing. That will be far more expensive than any of the cars that you or I have ever driven or ever drive. So it actually kind of indicates a value. So if God refurbished humanity and kind of created humanity out of them, that is him actually dignifying that line and saying there's value there that he wanted to recover and take forward and be part of and kind of integrate with. And that act of doing that itself is intrinsic validation of the intrinsic worth and value of it, of that history, even if what we have now is different. So, I mean, I get what you're saying, that it's not maybe how we'd always think about it, but I think both things can be true at the same time, where Adam and Eve is created de novo out of the dust in like a sacred or covenantal relationship with God that he falls from. And God was trying to do something with him in this larger history on earth that he'd actually created and was doing. and that he saw great value. He saw so much value in them that he created Adam to be a blessing to them, yet he became a curse. And then he sent Jesus to save them. That's how much he valued them. And if he refurbished them, he's talking about people that are refurbished. So that grants them value. And if you're a Muslim, then you'd say that God even sent Muhammad to them. Right? So those acts dignify them because we're dignified by the value that God places on us, not something intrinsic to us in this sense, right? And so God's revelation to us dignifies us far more than the particular details of how it created us, right?
Well, it's again, as I started by saying, it's a philosophical question whether a direct intervention out of the basic materials, creating, not only giving the soul a special soul with free will, but also giving the whole body, the whole thing, directly from God. In my opinion, it's more dignified. But well, we can differ on that. Yet my next question is, if what Adam has brought was a covenant with God.
In terms of differing, I think it would be really interesting to see, especially if you could work with another Muslim scholar and actually kind of clarify what are those issues with more detail. That would be interesting to see, like written out, maybe even in an academic paper. That would be helpful in taking the conversation forward to clarify what really is at stake. And maybe as you do that, you find out maybe it's not as much as you thought, or maybe you'll be able to clarify more precisely, and we can clarify more on the science what that means, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So another observation is that God is completely adamant, both in Christianity and Islam, to point out that we were made from this origin, from dust. But he makes no mention whatsoever. So to the other part of the story, in your opinion, as a scientist, which is common ancestry with great apes, so why would he do this exclusion, in your opinion?
Well, to be clear, Scripture is just never the whole story. It doesn't tell you the whole. No story tells you everything. It's selective. It just tells you the part that's important to the purpose of the story. Right. You asked me who I am in my story, and I started telling you that. There's a lot of details I left out. In fact, I didn't tell you very much at all about my parents. I mean, they only appear in the peripheral vision, and if you're paying close attention, you would have realized I said that I was born here, which kind of implies that they were born in India, which is actually the case. They were born there, right? But I didn't really mention those details because it wasn't important to the story. And so you could say, well, wait a minute. Why is it that your story left out these details about your family? That they were born in India, particularly. I mean, that would be just absurd. That would be an absurd objection because that's just not how stories work. Stories, it's important to what they do. And so what it's doing here is it does say that we're continuous with God's creation, which does seem to be very much about, very consistent with the idea of common descent. It even says that animals and plants are not made directly by God, but they're made by the land and the sea, it says, which is once again very closely connected to the evolutionary account and is very consistent with that. But it's not really about that story. It's about these sacred covenantal humans and how they fell and how God is trying to call them back to him. And how Jesus is a key part of that story. And I do think that Muslims are part of the story too, to be clear. I think that God gave Jesus for all of us, including you. And he's been speaking to a lot of different cultures. And so you would probably you do put a higher emphasis on Muhammad as a prophet. But the key point, I would say, is that there's a universal story unfolding, and it's not actually the theologically important part of that story isn't our descent from the people outside the garden. That's the scientifically important part of the story. The theologically important part of the story is our descent from Adam and Eve.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So the people outside the garden are not covenantal people, and yet we have evidence way beyond 10,000 years for rituals and for burials and for this kind of thing. To me, it means that those people had religion, whether we call them Neanderthals or we call them whatever else, or even Homo sapiens that are older than 10,000 years. And how would that reconcile?
Well, so I didn't say they had no religion. I said, I mean, I think we can say fairly certainly they had no written law.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, Scripture doesn't really tell us about what's going on with them. So from that evidence that you're pointing to, we can conclude that, you know, they had, you know, for somehow they had a sense of the afterlife. Either it was written in their hearts or God told them directly somehow. You know, and that they had a sense of these things. They were kind of reaching for the divine, because God designed them to be interacting with the divine eventually, but God just wasn't interacting with them as directly and clearly as he did through the law and the prophets and through Jesus, and making himself known in written text. So it wasn't carried over from generation to generation in the same way we do now.
So let me ask you this. There are Muslims and Christians who accept evolution. And I have seen some of them on both sides. And I have had hundreds or thousands of conversations with atheists and with Christians and Muslims. And there is a dichotomy. There is, if somebody believes in evolution, the odds are he will be an atheist. Is your book?
I mean, it depends who you're talking from, but I mean, maybe.
Maybe.
But yeah, there are a lot of atheists that are from evolution. There's a lot of people who left the faith because of evolution.
Absolutely. So can we consider your book to be a path for people to keep the faith, even if they are overwhelmed by the scientific evidence and they cannot, they accept the evidence and they say, okay, evolution looks like a fact, and they just want to preserve the faith. And their problem is with Adam and Eve because it's so obvious in Scripture. Is your book a path for those people to keep both the faith and the current scientific narrative, let's say?
Yes, it's a path. It's a two-way path. You know, I was explaining before, you kind of mentioned and you keyed into a really key phrase I used to explain myself. I'm a Christian in science and a scientist in the church, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of occupying this third space between two worlds, or maybe more worlds, you know, and I think a good way to think about it is as a bridge between two worlds. And people can go back and forth across the bridge. You can't really control the direction they go on the bridge, but you can put the bridge there. So I think for some people, it shows how, when they've come to be certain that evolution is true, how maybe they need to consider with more legitimacy the religious traditions. And for people that are more religious, it means that, you know, maybe they need to grant more legitimacy to what could be going on in science with evolution. Now, I do think also it is a real challenge to people that have relied in any way on incompatibility between evolution and particular religious beliefs to really reconsider those decisions. So sometimes I've talked to atheists that have said a key reason why they left the faith is because Genesis was not compatible with evolution, and evolution, there's just a ton of evidence for it. I think that, I think my book shows that was really faulty reasoning. That was really based on a fallacious or false belief. And I think that they have to think about that. At the same token, I think a lot of Christians or Muslims that have rejected evolution because it's in direct conflict with the religious account. Also, I think, if they're thoughtful and are careful and are honestly with themselves first, I think they have to recognize that maybe they need to reconsider that, because maybe there's reasons to reject evolution, but that's not a good reason anymore.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. What if there were no people outside the garden and somebody has faith and he wants, or Adam and Eve is more important and the religious narrative is more important to him than anything else, and he does not want to accept people outside the garden? What would be the solution then? A 200,000-year-old Adam and Eve?
You're saying if he's just stubborn. Because you're saying you can't do much for stubborn people, but he's missing out. There's a fun conversation to be had. If you want to be like the difficult person who's just objecting for no reason except for that you just want to have it your way. You can do that. I mean, but you just kind of end up pretty, you know, isolated and kind of cut out of the fun conversation. I think a better way to put it is like, why is that important? And are you sure that those reasons why are not actually attended to by some way of putting this together? That's the better conversation. And now maybe not. And, you know, there's an article that was just published actually about my book. It was a response by a theologian. I think it was in Norway or whatever, but I can send you a link to it. But he had a metaphor that I think was really helpful as he was describing my book. He said that, you know, a lot of Christians and maybe a lot of Muslims too are that when you think about evolution and the faith, the two can never be wed. So never be wed, right? That's one place to be. Another possibility is that they're wed, right? That you can kind of wed these things two together, right? But I'm not really arguing for that. What I'm arguing is kind of this third space, which you could say is, are they courting? And that's what I'm doing. I'm going to the person who's like that. I'm saying, okay, you're saying they never can be wed, but there's a lot of stuff people got stuff wrong in the science. I'm clearing that up. For a long time, people said the reason why they reject evolution is reasons 1, 2, 3. I'm showing the reasons 1, 2, 3 are not actually a problem. That they were confused on the science. So can we start courting? Courting is not a commitment. It's the dating. Like, let's just get to know each other, put the stuff on the table, what's really important, what's really left still, and are those really non-negotiables or not? Really, do we understand each other enough? And maybe through that, you'll still come to conclude at the very end that they never can be wed. Fine. Or maybe you'll conclude that they can be wed. And I think actually quite a large number of people are going to be willing to go to the courting stage, not sure if it could be wed. And then after looking at that and really understanding more, which is, I think, the basis of wisdom. Wisdom is not based on stubbornness. It's not based on controlling people. It's not based on just putting your foot down or false boldness. It's actually based on understanding. So let's understand each other through courting. I think actually as we understand across this divide, I think a large number of people are going to say, oh, I guess they could be wed. And so maybe it's not such a big problem.
So let's put it in a nutshell there. You're saying that science has no objection to Adam and Eve being 6,000 to 10,000 years ago in the Middle East.
Anytime, right?
Yeah. In the Middle East, created de novo from dust and a rib.
Ancestors of us all.
Yeah. And the solution to the genetics that we can see today is that there are some people outside of the garden who were human enough to interbreed with Adam and Eve's lineage. Those people, if somebody chooses that those people are not necessarily descended with apes from great apes, then he will have to find a justification for the similarity, but it does not affect the narrative. To that end, he can also find a reconciliation with his scripture, whether in your side Christian, in my side Muslim,
or Jew,
because there is at both sides enough narrative that that Adam and Eve were not the first human or people who God would call Khalifa, and angels, for example, in my tradition, had this concern, which has to come from background. So
it's interesting. You're pointing to the Muslim tradition that makes space for it, but there's a ton of Christian tradition too. This isn't actually a big compromise or revision of it. It's actually a recovery of actually what people have been thinking about this for a long time, right?
Yeah. Would you like to have a couple of comments from the?
Sure.
One final thing before we go to the comments. It's about maybe you can do something about that in another episode. It's about the evolution thing itself. My personal objection to the evolution is the adamant insistence of evolutionists that the process is random.
Yeah, but you have to understand what that. So first of all, there are atheists that are trying to say random, meaning ontological randomness, meaning that God can't be part of it. All right. But there's a large number of Christians, I would say that they're random too, but I mean in a totally different way than I think how you're hearing it. I just mean that it's random from a human point of view, which means that it's not fully predictable. From like humans cannot fully predict it. That's all I mean. So I model with a random variable. In the same way, I would model, for example, I don't know where I'm going out for dinner today or what I'm eating for dinner. My wife is part of that decision. I don't know what she wants to eat. If she wants to go out to eat, we're probably going to go out to eat. Okay. So are we going to go out to eat today? Well, that's a random variable in my head. So it's a random concern. Now, it doesn't mean that my wife doesn't know. From her point of view, it may not be random at all. Maybe she knows and she already has plans. And that's the level of randomness. You're saying from my point of view, I can't predict it. So I'll say maybe there's a 20% chance that we're going to go out to eat today. That's my guess. So that's a random variable. That is the only sense really in which we mean randomness when it comes to evolution.
So your perspective is that it is random. It looks random to us, but it does not. It in reality, theologically, it is not, because God's providence is making things happen in the time that to him.
In Scripture, it says that God governs the cast of lots. Lots is like essentially equivalent to rolling dice. It says that God knows what happens when you roll dice. That is like a strong metaphor for saying that God knows what happens in what we consider random. That is, I think, a very close interpretation of what's being said there. So it's actually very consistent with what Scripture teaches to say that these things look random to us, but that doesn't mean it's random to God. That God providentially governs the cast of random lots, the cast of random dice, and certainly random mutations. So why would that be considered a theological problem? I think that's only a theological problem if you take that next step, as that the atheist does, but science doesn't demand, of saying that God wasn't involved because it was random. But that's completely an absurd claim.
All right. So it's like some people in my tradition appealing to what they would refer to as occasionalism. Maybe this is some of the work also.
Well, occasionalism is something different. That means that God is directly involved by fiat in every single thing, even in like just, if I take a coin and drop it, God is directly involved. So that's not what I'm saying. I mean, God can work I think the language in Christian theology is providential governance.
Yeah.
So that includes putting rules into place by which things operate, and it allows for God directly intervening and doing things, right? But it doesn't necessarily implicate him by direct choice in every single little thing that happens, every single atom that moves, he was pushing it around. But he kind of institutes laws by which things operate, and at times he intervenes, and he does this so that the progress of the world goes towards the purposes that he's ordained. So it's not occasionalism, meaning there's no real laws, but it is, or there's no real patterns of things interacting somewhat on their own, that God kind of created those laws. But it is maybe he's allowed to occasionally intervene, and he does. That's not occasionalism. That's different. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what they're saying there is that yes, he is intervening. Every single thing that happens at every single point of time is directed directly by God.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's governed by God, right?
Yeah. I mean, the other story. And so even what looks random to us is not. And the guidance is hidden in the random signal. And my problem with that, which can also be with not that much changes mapped to the governance part, that God is guiding it. It looks random to us, but he is guiding it, and he's making the things happen in the specific time. Maybe that can explain something like the Cambrian explosion, for example. My problem with that would be that, for example, in my tradition, so God tells the faithful and tells those who want to find him to look for him at the horizons. My explanation to that would be at the horizons of knowledge. So it means that the more you learn science, the more you understand more about the grandeur of God and how. But
I think that's true too. So I see God's beauty in creation. Like I see like an amazing artist that created a world of more beauty than I personally could ever imagine. I mean, my son loves dinosaurs, and he's only 5 years old. He's kept on asking me over and over again, what can you tell me more about dinosaurs? I've run out of things to tell him. So now we actually read science papers on paleontology together at night. My little 5-year-old is like, he's always saying, can we read a science paper now?
Yeah.
And we'll pick up a story, go over the figures, and we'll just find out all these new crazy creatures that God created that are just beautiful. It's like it really is endless forms, most beautiful. And yeah, so I see God's beauty there. It is a testament to his glory, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the language of what I just said there works as a scientific argument.
Yeah. So so he says this: look, we will show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves until they know that it is the truth. And in another place in the Quran, he says, walk the earth and look how creation has started. So my question would be, and this might be a pretext for a coming thing, because you're a scientist and you believe in God. And why would God take that much trouble to obscure himself behind a random process?
I would totally disagree with that characterization that he's obscuring himself. That I don't think is the case. I think it's rather that we have limited vision. We think that science operates like the eye of Sauron. You know what Lord of the Rings is? It's almost like godlike ability to see the past. That's just false. It's a street light and it's a telescope. So we were just overconfident in the ability of human study of creation to think that it could tell us things that it couldn't. We just need to take a more humble view of science. And it's not God hiding himself. It's just that we don't have the ability to reach God as humans. And in fact, God had to reach down to us. That is what I think that solves that problem. It really has to do a misunderstanding of what you can see in science. And this becomes really clear as you start understanding the science more without the presupposition that it must tell us certain things. And in fact, I would tell you that this actually makes sense of why God appears to us in Revelations, and not meaning the book of Revelation, but through revealing himself in scriptures. Because if we could see everything important in nature, there wouldn't be a need for scripture. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of stuff that he wanted to tell us that we could never get from studying nature. And so, it actually makes quite a bit of sense that to know God, we actually have to look at scripture. And what he's written about himself too.
Well, that's a philosophical difference, and maybe even a difference in tradition, because, for example, in Islam, the God puts it to us that we can find him through his written word, or through his created word.
Yeah, but that's in Christianity too. But it's not the same. It's not that you could say you get rid of the Bible and in your case, get rid of the Quran and you could be essentially the same as a Muslim. There's some value in scripture. There's some value in the Quran,
of course,
that extends beyond what you get in nature. So there's certain things that are true about God that you can get from the Quran, but not from nature, is what you're saying. Yeah. And so if you accept that, and then also the fact of the matter is that there are ways to get, for example, the idea that God created everything by studying nature that are just outside science. Science is not the only way of studying nature. Poets studying. My son and I are studying nature when we read a science paper, even though that isn't actually science that we're doing. We're just looking and appreciating the beauty of God's creation. And that is a true study of nature that is giving us rightly to this idea that God created all things. And he created a beautiful, good world, but it is not actually being, it's not actually science. And that shouldn't be a bother to us. Science is a pretty narrow way of looking at the world. It's important, it's valuable, but it's not the only way of looking at creation. The Quran doesn't mention science. The Bible doesn't mention science either, because the modern scientific method only really appears, like maybe 500 years ago, long after the Quran was written, long after, the Bible's written. So any reference to nature and studying nature isn't confining us to the scientific way of engaging it. We're allowed to look at and study nature a really broad range of ways, right?
In the case of Islam, actually, the Quran mentions science, and it makes this statement that those who are in the best position to be God-fearing are scientists.
Well, the word scientist meant something different. I mean, what was the Arabic word? I mean, it wasn't the same thing as the Copernican revolution. It wasn't the same thing as all of that. I mean, part of this gets to how I read history too. I think modern science is modern. I mean, it's a fairly recent endeavor. Now, if they meant it in relation to, for example, the Greek philosophers that were scientists of a sort, and some of their incarnations. I mean, I guess that is one valid definition of science, but that's not the version of science that we have now currently, if that makes any sense.
It depends on your belief of how far words in scripture would unfold to give new meanings to people at different times. Yeah. So
well, what I'm saying is that there was particular constraints in how we do science now that did not exist back then.
You mean
they had a broader definition of science than we have doing now. Our definition of science is far more narrow and controlled. And so
let me put this other question as another pretext for maybe this other episode. So you're a computational biologist, and you know that I'm an engineer. I'm an electronics engineer, and I spent like 30 years of my life with information systems. I also studied Islamic theology and business, but in computation.
Where do you live, by the way? Are you, or what country are you in?
So I am in Cairo now.
What?
Cairo.
Oh, you're in Egypt.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Hopefully there's some Coptic Christians listening in on this one too.
Yeah. So the question here is in computers, we have this problem of a random number generator. Yeah. We don't have a true random process, right? So let me put this to you. What if let's have this idea of a simulation. We're living in this simulation that God has created. It's called the universe. And he wants specific things to unfold at a specific time. And what evolutionary science is calling random mutation is nothing like random. It is just this formula unfolding.
It's pseudo-random. It looks to us, but because we don't know the formula, no one's told us. Yeah, that's entirely possible. I mean, I think that what that creates is something called, what I would say is that still raises the, that's like a type of super determinism. If you're saying that that's how all randomness is. But not necessarily if you're just saying how random mutations are. I think it still raises questions about how free will interacts with that. I'd say free will is just as much of a puzzle to integrate with God's sovereignty as is randomness. And so I think free will ends up, I think, being a bigger problem than randomness, because the randomness issues you can't actually solve, as you just said, by just saying it's pseudo-random. That it's actually fundamentally deterministic, and God knows it. That's entirely possible.
Well, you can have an entry point like, wave function collapses, and where things, at least as far as we understand now, get determined in a mysterious way in the last minute or the last second or the last split second. So there are actually doorways.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the fundamental physics.
But I don't think God requires determinism in that regard. I mean, I think it could still be random when God doesn't care the outcome, but then he fixes the outcome when he cares. That's entirely possible too. Just because he doesn't care. I mean, I don't, when I understand God, I don't understand him as a hyper-controlling person that cares what direction every atom goes. It seems like he's caring about more high-level things like you and me and like who we are and and even a lot of people would say that's about as significant as like an atom bouncing around. Okay. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is super determinism and he really does care about where the carbon atom goes, maybe. Right. I mean, that's beyond my comprehension of God, but maybe that's who he is. Okay. That wouldn't be a problem. I mean, that's consistent with science. I'm just not sure if it's really demanded by theology. That's all. Does that make sense?
In Islamic theology, God is omniscient in a very detailed way, in like every small speck everywhere.
Sure. I mean, I'm not saying omniscience and control are different things. So he could know what's going to happen, but not really care. All right.
Yeah. Well, also in Islam, God has this unlimited capacity. So if he cares about every single detail and he controls every single detail,
I mean, now we're talking about angels dancing on a pinhead. I mean, maybe. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about how to understand the mind of God. I mean, there are Christians that I know would say things very similar to what you're saying. I'm just saying I don't know. I just know that God is greater than me. He created all things. He's omniscient, all powerful, and beyond my comprehension. And that the biggest weird thing about it all is that somehow he loves me. That's the part I have the hardest time understanding. So, and that he actually cares about me and is engaged in my world. That's like, for me, the biggest puzzle to work through, because a God that big, I can't give an account of why he would care. But there's different strands in both, I think, the Christian and the Muslim view on how to think through that. And I think that is a fun conversation to have. But I think the good thing about that is that it can become a fun theological conversation, or no longer a fight with science. I mean, this evolution doesn't really tell us one way or the other on that. It just doesn't. Now, maybe the atheist tries to make it seem like evolution does, but then the evolution is just wrong. Just tell him he's wrong, and then he needs to learn more about the science.
One of the things I liked about, because I also watched many of your interviews, is your confession that evolution and biology in general does not have the answers to all questions, and there are plenty of gaps there.
Oh yeah, and any good scientist, including atheist scientists, would agree with me on that.
Not the ones that are putting themselves at the frontier of scientific journalism, I would say.
Well, a lot of them. So look, my biggest struggles have not actually been with atheist scientists, though there are some that are a little bit difficult. It's been mainly with, I think, atheist science groupies.
Yeah.
So, or science, not even just atheist groupies, but even Christian groupies or religious groupies to science that aren't actually scientists, don't actually know how science works, kind of take, scientific conclusions as God's truth, and are kind of thumping those away, and are kind of opposed to any sort of nuanced engagement. But that's not science. That's just science groupies. I think they just need to learn more about how science works. And as a person who really cares about science and is a scientist, I think that the task is not so much how to integrate with that very narrow, naive view of science. Who cares about that fundamentally? That sort of stuff I hope we all grow out of. Rather, it's how do we engage sensibly, non-confrontationally, and conversationally with evolutionary science? And you're a person who has been opposed to evolution. I'm just asking you to court it. You don't have to accept it. And I think you are doing that in this conversation. The invitation is really just to say, maybe it isn't this isn't like a situation of mortal enemies. Maybe actually there's an opportunity for a better sort of long-term productive relationship. So let's court.
So you used to disbelieve in evolution, was young Earth creationist, and now you're with this new position. So would you like to go into another episode to tell us the key evidence that made you change your mind?
Yeah, we can talk about that. That'll be another episode. We can schedule it. And I would love to share with you kind of my path through that. I think it might actually mirror what's going on, because what I've observed is that there is different strands of Islam that mirror in some ways what I've seen in Christianity. So on one hand, I've seen a really deep and respectable tradition of inquiry and mathematics and science engaged thinking that even continues to this day with thoughtful Muslim theologians. I've also seen a fundamentalist strand that is almost like a know-nothing certainty, and that is not really committed to tolerance, but even, at times even exerting power, just like I see in Christianity at times, and I think that the best side of Islamic tradition has been the side that has been what that first strand of it, right? And I think that I think it's good for everyone as Christians recover that strand of Christianity and Muslims recover that strand of Islam. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and let me also maybe give you. I had some more questions, but for some reason the system.
Yeah, there's also a lot of these people here that are asking questions in the chat too.
Yeah, I lost some of them for some reason.
Mohammed Zaitun, you really do not like evolution. I get that, but are you willing to actually look and see if you understood what it is and if we could court?
So, Mohammed.
Oh, and you wanted to know the book too. The book is the Genealogical Adam and Eve. So
I have actually. I'll put also a link to it in the description. You actually even have a link that would give some person the opportunity to read a couple of chapters free, and then they can decide to buy it. But then Muhammad at the end says, you mean that randomness is proportionate or relative? I think so. That was when we were discussing that maybe random is not that much random. And
random is perspectival, right? So there's the omniscient perspective, in which there is no true randomness, and then there's the human perspective, where just about anything can seem random.
So he makes another note. He says logic does not answer all creation questions. That's why we have what we call belief. To explain the creation of a mosquito, what about humans? and other creatures and the universe. And he also says that all scholars and scientists put forth tons of hypotheses behind scientific theories, then presented as facts that contradicts with logical beliefs. We need to distinguish between.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the question is there. Do you know what the question is there?
I think he's referring to the matter of randomness driving everything, and that this hypothesis seems counterintuitive.
Well, you know, here's one. Can you put this one where he says God created Adam from a fist from all earth clay? This implies that Adam's genome was the genome for all people are in Adam. So I think if you put that on the screen, I mean, this is a really great point that he's making. It's important that he says implies. That means that he's admitting up front that that's not actually what it says. It just implies that. So he's read that in. And so we're allowed to question whether or not that's the correct implication. And also even what that means. So
for some reason, I can't see it. This is from who? From Muhammad also?
Muhammad, yeah. At noon, minute 37.
For some reason, I cannot see it, but okay. Yeah, it's...
The other thing, too, is he says this implies that the genome for all people are in Adam. And yeah, I think what he's saying is what that means is that we all get our genetics from him. But the genome for all people could be in Adam, but we didn't get it from him. In the same way, my brother has DNA, that matches mine exactly because we share the same parents. But he didn't get it from me. I think... So I think... he has to be a little more careful about what actually Scripture is saying versus what it demands, and what he thinks, and also really even what he's saying it demands isn't even in conflict with what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think what he's coming from is the point that I raised before, that what if there was nobody outside of the garden who was human or good for breeding? Then Adam and Eve would be our genetic ancestors too, and then we would need to figure out how they could have fostered all the genetic diversity.
Yeah, so the way you solve that is just by putting them more and more ancient. And some parts of the Christian tradition are okay with that. Some parts of the Christian tradition are not okay with that. I helped Bill Craig with his latest book. He puts Adam and Eve at about 750,000 years ago.
But if we put them at 10,000 years and we put an assumption for an accelerated kind of guided mutation or an abnormal richness of genetic information.
I don't think that works. I mean, I haven't seen a model where it works, and it's not like I haven't tried. So, I mean, maybe there's a way to, but we're not going to resolve it here.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to kind of get into those details, we can.
Is it because of the number of offspring, the potential for reproduction?
Yeah, well, there's that, and there's also Noahic flood. If you get rid of the Noahic flood being universal, then there's still this issue of that. But then there's also the problem of, we have pretty good evidence that the way how DNA is inherited has been pretty constant, actually, over the last 10,000 years. With ancient genomes and very human. I mean, we have Homo sapien, skeletons even, going back, depending on, how you count it, certainly 100,000 years ago, and maybe even as far as 300,000 years ago. So, I mean, where do those skeletons come from? And we don't have to talk about the DNA at this point. There's just very clear evidence of people going back that look just like us physically, at least, going back long before 10,000 years ago that you have to deal with.
So the gist of it, if you accept people outside the garden, and you don't even want to see them coming from great apes, but there are some other people who have other genetic diversity, and they are with enough numbers, and you accept Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago in the Middle East.
So you don't have to accept evolution to take this. You could just say that. But then I think it just raises the question of why exactly are you rejecting it? And I think the reasons you gave... But yeah, I think the reasons you give are actually fairly weak. I think it's more. It seems more like the people kind of objecting at that point. And I'm not. I mean, if you want to go down that path, I don't care. I'm not going to come at you with evidence that doesn't exist. But I'm looking at the reasons, and they actually really seem more like people are stretching and reaching for reasons that they didn't have to begin with, and they're trying to get and justify that. Which is just a sign. I mean, that's a very normal human thing to do when you've been exposed to something for a very long time, and now all your reasons for opposing it are gone. So the question is, why still oppose it? Is that really what you want to do or not? I mean, why do you care? That's, I think, the real point where it comes to. And maybe you'll be the one who actually gives me some really solid, clearly reasoned answers that don't sound that way, Ahmed. So I'm not trying to be totally dismissive here.
Okay, so we have a date for another one where you will start from rejecting evolution to accepting evolution, and maybe we have some good ideas to exchange there. We had our 90 minutes, so thank you very much for coming, and I hope it was a fun conversation to you too.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I'm actually curious, and we'll talk offline in a moment. I mean, I hope you can introduce some more Muslim scholars to what we've been doing, and I'd love to start having some conversations with them.
That would be also a good idea, especially those who are looking into this. I appreciate your work. It was a fun read to go through your book. More than 200 pages, and it goes very calm and explores different fronts. And
you don't like evolution, so it's kind of a big deal to say that, right?
Yeah. Well, you will not find. I'm a tolerant person, you guys. And I think you are a tolerant person too. So it's good. It's good to have a good dialogue about contentious issues, and I think it's the only way. This channel is about finding the truth, and I think there aren't so much chances to find the truth if you will not explore all possible paths. Because the truth is eventually very strong, and if you stand in front of it, it's going to crush you, and if you accept it, it will prevail anyway, whether you accept it or not, right? I think you believe that too. So.
I tell you what, I want to come back and talk about evolution. I think it'd be really fun to do too, though. I'll just put this in your ear and then we can probably end it. At some point, we should come back and talk about Jesus too. That I think would be a fun conversation as well.
I don't mind, and even Muslims love Jesus.
And, so let's talk about him. I would love to do that. You said you were going to maybe read some of the Gospels. So maybe
I have actually read plenty of John. And within reading the book, I have had to go, and typically when I read a verse, I would read all the translations. And it is part of the Islamic doctrine to accept that the Bible is a divine revelation.
I know. So like, I'm just asking you to be a good Muslim, and let's just have that conversation. It'd be fun. Hey, great to talking to you. Thank you for listening and all. And I guess you'll be seeing me again. I look forward to it.
Yeah, we have two dates: one about Jesus and one about evolution. And thank you very much, Josh, for coming. And it was a fun conversation. And your book is really fun to read.
Thanks a lot.
All right. So thanks, everybody. And just an announcement. So next Saturday, there will be Professor Keith Ward, who is also going to share with us on the channel some very interesting ideas about Christianity. Maybe you would join this one on the audience, Josh. And he's a scholar of Christianity, and he's going to share some ideas about how Christianity and Islam can actually be telling very comparable stories, and he believes in one God. So thanks a lot for coming, Josh, and let's agree on a couple of dates for more conversation, and it was really fun having you.
Absolutely.
All right. I'm going to end the broadcast now. So thanks, everybody, for joining. And if you have more questions for Josh for the coming episodes, please put them on the comment section, and maybe we'll include them there too. Bye now.